You're listening to the Celestial Citizen podcast, and I'm your host, Britt Duffy Adkins. Celestial Citizen is a space media company with embedded urban planning values, looking to help shape a more equitable and just future for all of us in space. This podcast seeks to provide an opportunity for conversation about how to be a better interplanetary citizen and responsible steward of Earth and the cosmos, by engaging the global public, providing greater access to the space industry, and amplifying a more diverse set of voices. Progress in space can equate to progress on Earth. We who are bursting with stardust can become celestial citizens. Today, I'm very excited to be speaking with Billy Almon.
The thing that I'm exploring and trying to connect the dots on is reminding particularly African American students that the connection to pursuing the stars, not only as a form of us finding liberation, but also as an ancestral part of who we are, is something that is inherent. So you have an ancestral background to give you confidence to explore that if that's something that you're interested in.
We'll discuss what it means to be an astrobiofuturist, how nature can inform design both on and off this planet, and maybe even a little bit about the infamous lunar tardigrade incident.
There's all of these organisms that are alive today that have gone through trying to innovate in their own biology, solutions that will help them live, and not only live, but thrive in different types of environments and under different types of conditions. We're tapping into the strategies that they use in this living library that we call planet Earth. And then we're taking those strategies and turning them into designs that work for us at the human scale.
My guest on the show is Billy Almon. Billy is an astrobiofuturist exploring biology-inspired solutions to improve the human condition for those of us on Earth and those who will travel to the stars. He speaks to multiple generations of inventors, designers, scientists, and engineers on designing the future they wish to see. Previously, Billy was a creative director at Walt Disney Imagineering, leading efforts to develop immersive experiences and environments around the world. He is an inventor and holds a master's degree in biomimicry from Arizona State University and a bachelor's degree in architecture from Howard University. Billy sits on the board of directors for the Biomimicry Institute, the world's leading authority on nature solutions to design challenges. He also teaches biomimetic design at the Minneapolis College of Art and Design. Thanks so much for joining Celestial Citizen Podcast, Billy. It's great to have you here.
It is great to be here. I'm excited. From the minute that we met on Clubhouse and you said that you had a podcast, it was like something I wanted to do in the upcoming years. I'm so happy to be here.
Well, and for people who don't know, these were like back on the early days of Clubhouse. It was like such a moment in time. I feel like the pandemic was still going on. Everybody was just trying to find some human connection. We were all on there talking about space and the future. Met a lot of cool people on there, and yourself included.
I remember when it was like maybe one of the Giant Leaps conversations, and you were talking about diversity and equity in space. And that's what I was like, okay, this is someone I need to connect with, because this is the first time in these conversations I've heard someone bring this up that wasn't a person of color. So I was like, okay, she knows what's up.
Which is a shame, because conversations should be like happening all the time and in concert with like everything that we're planning in space. But yeah, I'm so glad that we were able to connect. And obviously, like, we have a lot of shared passions and interests and things like that. So about time we got you here on the podcast. So I'm really excited to dive into this conversation because, as mentioned in your bio, you're an astrobiofuturist, which just sounds really cool, first off, right off the bat. So, can you share a little bit about yourself and sort of the path that led you to becoming an astrobiofuturist and what that is?
You said, like, I worked for Walt Disney Imagineering. And the cool thing about working there is that Walt Disney Imagineering is where historically all of the creative ideas around the attractions, the themed lands. If you've ever been to Disney World or Universal or any of these theme parks, the people that get to dream up these future places where families get to have great experiences and memories are formed and made, being a part of that culture and being a part of the place and around all the creative minds that get to dream up and then build these things in the real world for people to live and experience was a huge part of just my professional upbringing. And so storytelling is a big part of that work. I've always had a passion for nature. In 2006, I was studying at Howard University, and that was also the time where Hurricane Katrina hit the Gulf Coast. And myself and 500 other Howard University students, we just got on buses and went down during our spring break to just help out in any way that we could. And in going down there and seeing that devastation firsthand, at the time, not only as a Black man in America, but also as an architecture student, as a design student, it was frustrating, it was heartbreaking, and it left me with a lot of questions of like, how do we prevent cities from experiencing this kind of natural and man-made disaster? And how do we prevent this from constantly happening to communities of color and poverty-stricken communities? And so when I went back and just kind of studying that and thinking about my thesis project, I came across this book called Biomimicry: Innovation Inspired by Nature, written by Janine Benyus. And it completely changed my life. Like I was like, okay, designing the way nature does things, that's me from now on. And fast forward, I got my master's in it. And so to answer your question in a long but short but long way, astrobiofuturism is essentially the exploration of the intersection of space exploration, what comes out of space exploration, and what can come out of space technology, intersecting with human experiences, the way that we experience life, how we can design experiences to be better, how we can design experiences to improve the human condition, and how we can also learn from nature's strategies to build a better world for the planet and for the human condition as well. So it's really intersecting those three things and seeing how do they impact each other, but also what happens when you look at that node, that nexus point where they all intersect. And so that's what I get to do as an astrobiofuturist. In a lot of ways, it's the culmination of all of the things that I've been able to do over the course of my career, but also anything that I do now is through that trifold lens. So all the work that I do now is essentially astrobiofuturism.
And that's just such a fascinating area. This is amazing when you think about it because it's really like this idea that you're sort of taking all of these observations about nature. And also, just I love how there's so much inherent curiosity built into astrobiofuturism and the work that you do. And you're really taking all of that and then saying, okay, what can we learn from this? And I think that that's something that we as humans don't do enough. We're so focused on just trying to engineer everything to work for us the way we think it should, instead of looking at all of our natural neighbors or whatever you want to call them and sort of seeking inspiration from what's already out there. And one of the areas that you just brought up is biomimicry. And also, that's, of course, what your master's degree is in as well. So let's start with that. Can you kind of go into a little bit more detail about exactly what biomimicry is and how we should be starting to integrate that more into design?
Biomimicry is this approach to problem solving, whether it's a technical problem or a process or system, where the foundation is this idea that nature, regardless of what type of belief people have, most cultures' beliefs tend to form around the idea that nature existed first and then we came along. And so if nature came first, there's a precedent that they have around trial and error, to say it plainly, like through the process of natural selection. All of these different organisms that have been on this planet for millions of years have gone through this process of trial and error where they have developed these adaptations, and some were really great for the operating conditions of their environment. And then some were really bad adaptations, and those that had the bad adaptations, they're not around anymore. So what we say is that for over 3.8 billion years of life existing on this planet, plus, the Earth has served as this R&D lab for all living things to go through this trial and error process. And so what we say as designers and problem solvers who use biomimicry is essentially tapping into the fact that there are other living things on this planet that have solved for issues around circulation, issues around thermal regulation, issues around sustainability, issues around resource management. There's all of these organisms that are alive today that have gone through trying to innovate in their own biology solutions that will help them live, and not only live but thrive in different types of environments and under different types of conditions. And so what we say is we're tapping into the strategies that they use. We're emulating the existing strategies that are out there in this living library that we call planet Earth. And then we're taking those strategies and turning them into designs that work for us at the human scale. So one example I always use is Velcro. Velcro was invented by a Swiss inventor who would take his dog for walks through the forest. And he would always notice that there were these balls that had these little curly Q little hooks called burr seeds that were always attached to the fur of his dog whenever they went on walks. And so he took it under a microscope one day and he saw those curly Q little hooks. And he said, this is actually a great way to attach things to each other. And that is actually the function of those hooks, is so that the seeds would attach to the fur of animals traveling through the forest so that they could essentially get an Uber ride to a place where they could then fall off and propagate and become another tree and plant and so forth. So Velcro was invented by this Swiss inventor, forget his name, but him emulating attachment hook mechanism and turning that into something that I think I have on my shoes right now.
I love it. Well, yeah, and of course, Velcro is super useful in space as well. But I just love this idea though of Earth as an R&D lab. I don't know. I feel like I've never heard anybody explain it quite like that. And I think that's, just such a cool way of phrasing it. It's super interesting, of course. And yeah, I think learning from nature for a lot of the way that we design things is something that we should really be doing a lot more of. Now, I am curious though, like, do you ever see designs in nature and think, no, this is just terrible? Like, we absolutely do not want to mimic that. Like, is there anything where you just go, like, that's terrible natural design?
Nature does some, what I would say is some disgusting stuff. Like, I think there's some worms, I think they expel their stomach, basically like vomit up their stomach onto whatever it is they're trying to eat it, to like digest it outside of their body, and then they absorb the nutrients from that, and then they pull their stomach basically back into their body.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely don't want to do that.
Yeah, so there's some stuff like that where I'm like, "That is disgusting, like, why did you feel the need to do that?" Off the top of my head, I'm like, "Well, could we come up with trash bags that could fold inside out and they digest a lot of, they kind of self-composting trash bags that have, like, some kind of inside liner." I'm just brainstorming off the top of my head, it doesn't make any sense. I think if anything, the crazy stuff is the stuff that gets fun about, like, okay, how can this translate to some kind of functional challenge that we have as humans? That's the fun of it, on the other side of the disgusting stuff that you find in nature. Mimicry itself is a natural thing, right? Caterpillars that look like snakes, et cetera, et cetera. There's this one moth that actually its camouflage is what looks like two flies eating bird poop. Like, that's the camouflage. But I think it also emits a smell of, like, emulating bird poop as a scent, as a detractor. So it's disgusting stuff like that, but it's like, that's also really kind of cool in a weird, disgusting way. And that's, nature be wildin'. Nature be wildin'.
I love it. Yeah, I mean, because it is interesting, like, how much we do like, even as humans, I think about sometimes, like, how much we mimic each other. I mean, this is kind of a strange example to give, but it's like if you're watching a lot of British TV or something like that, and then I find myself saying things differently, picking up this, like, phony accent somehow. We mimic the way things sound. Think about, like, also our behavior with technology and how many times are you on social media and you realize all your community people that like either follow you or you follow them, you start posting kind of like similar things or you get similar ads and things like that. Like, I don't know, is this something that we should expect as we evolve as humans? Are we going to sort of have this, intense mimicking event where we all start kind of becoming more and more the same? Or are we going to continue to have all of our, distinctions and sort of unique features about us?
I think that is baked into our DNA in a lot of ways, right? Like we are social creatures by learned behavior. If you're too divergent, then you don't necessarily fit into the tribe, and you have to fit into the tribe as a mechanism of survival. That's something we've cultivated throughout our ancestry of being humans on this planet. So even the sense of like things that go viral, fear of missing out and all of that, there's a lot of, I think, social evolutionary aspects and cultivation, I think, that are at play with that.
Oh my gosh, I never would have thought of that, but FOMO is like an evolutionary construct.
It's a working theory, but I think it has legs. Yeah.
So moving on to my next question here, why do you think more designers and architects are not actively looking to nature to help inform their work? Because I still feel like this is a fairly like niche field at the moment.
I think some of it is what's old is new again. So one of the things that we like to say who practice biomimicry is that biomimicry is an ancestral indigenous practice kind of having a new life again. And so for me, like one of the things that I'm very clear on is like making sure that we're not colonizing this idea of something that has been as localized and as indigenous and as honestly as old as we are. Another working theory around biomimicry is this idea, at least the way that I say it. One of our ancestors was walking through the forest one day. They were walking, and out of nowhere, they accidentally ran into a spider web and they got a spider web all over their hands and face. And then when they finally settled down and stopped freaking out, they looked at the spider web and they said, hey, this is actually a really cool way to catch things, right? That's the underlying function, right? To capture or to trap or ensnare. And from that, they said, I wonder if this will work for capturing fish. And they made a fish net from running into a spider web. That's my working theory. So, to answer your question, I think some of it is we're finally getting to a moment of starting to really acknowledge the ingenuity of indigenous cultures. We're just at the spear of letting those voices be recognized and heard. Sustainability for a lot of indigenous cultures, that wasn't a concept, it was balance. We created sustainability as a construct and a thing that we're now trying to do. One of the things with biomimicry is the sustainability part of it is a recent acknowledgement of biomimicry's abilities. So tank treads were inspired by caterpillars, bear traps were inspired by Venus flytraps. There's a Popular Science article from like 1933 where it talks about all of these cool things that were inspired by nature way back in 1933, right? But the problem is with those inventions, that's right around the time, the Industrial Revolution is taking off. The idea of waste in the midst of all that wasn't something that was thought of. So looking to nature for inspiration is something that we have been doing, but the idea that turning to nature to help us correct the problems of waste that we've created, I think that's the part that we're just catching up to in terms of proliferation of the idea of biomimicry.
And so, to tie this into our conversations about space and space exploration, space has, obviously very harsh environments that sort of lack that dynamic natural state that we find on Earth. So, are there any design strategies that can be informed by the local surroundings of other celestial bodies? So, in other words, like kind of the natural space state, if you will. Can we use that as we're thinking about designing?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that makes biomimicry so appealing as a tool for designing for space is the underlying principle that all innovation is local when it comes to the natural world, right? You have a whole bunch of niche innovations and innovators. They form some kind of special adaptation that makes them really well suited for specific environments. And I think that's also one of the cool things of looking at space as a place for biomimetic solutions to emerge because of that sense of locality. And the other thing about turning to nature for solutions is nature is inherently entrepreneurial because the primary currency in nature is energy. How do I get the most resources out of the amount of energy I have. Like cheetahs can run really, really fast, but they can only do it for a short amount of time. They've developed speed to maximize on the amount of energy that they have to capture something. Lions, they hunt in a pack and they go for larger things and they do it together. That's kind of their strategy and approach to it. So, how does that apply to space exploration? Well, space exploration, as we know, because of things like the Delta V and getting things into space and the amount of resources and energy it takes to launch things into space and the cost of getting things to space makes it where efficiency is a necessity. It is the necessity. Multifunctionality is the necessity of any innovation that is needed for space. And that's the same thing in nature. So, as a blank canvas, space exploration has nature as the perfect model for how to start things from nothing and use resources efficiently in innovative ways for conditions in space that you can also find on this planet. When I was getting my master's, one of the things that I tried to focus all of my assignments on was either space or something around social justice. And so on the space side, we do these studies called genius of place studies. And that's where we look at one particular location and we focus on one ecosystem and we try to map all of the organisms that contribute to the overall health and well being of that ecosystem. And so I focused on Himalayas and the alpine regions. There's a lot of similarities in space and lower Earth orbit. High exposure to solar radiation and UV, limited amount of oxygen, all these different kinds of things. So there's parallels that exist that make studying nature one of the best things, in my opinion, that we can do as we continue to find ways for us to explore further and further out in space.
Well, and of course, I've got to ask you this question because this is one I've been like really waiting to ask you for a while now. But you're also the host of Little Giants on Animal Planet, which showcases fascinating and small creatures that pack the biggest punch. I have to ask what your views are on tardigrades and what we can learn from their crash landing on the moon.
I love tardigrades. I think they're so dope. I still get knots in my stomach at the thought that, like, yeah, these tardigrades were just released and they're just floating out there now because something didn't work. And now, we've essentially introduced alien entities onto the lunar surface, whether they're alive or not. I know there's some questions around that, but still, like, it shouldn't have happened. Come on, y'all. Y'all got to be safer than that. But I do think their ability to essentially rehydrate and reanimate themselves is really cool. And I think once we start developing some more technological tools, we'll really start getting the benefits of a lot of these adaptations that tardigrades and other organisms have. I mean, tardigrades, they've lived forever. They can survive the harshest of conditions on this planet and in space. I think there's some questions around how do we ultimately end up mimicking some of their abilities. Some of that's going to be like biosynthetic, bioengineering stuff, which is a whole other conversation. And then some of it's going to be like biomimetic, like technology that emulates what they do on our behalf. And that's kind of where I lean more towards. I think some biosynthetic stuff has its place, but I just have a whole bunch of questions around some of that. Yeah, tardigrades are dope.
They are. We've really gotta put some more dollars towards research of tardigrades. I also think of in the show For All Mankind, in the first season where, like, the ants, they break the container that's holding the ants get loose on the space station, and it's like, we have to be careful, but it's also like humans, we make a lot of fumbles, right? So and it's like some of these are intentional, some of these are, well-meaning, some of them not so well-meaning, but at the end of the day, it is gonna be really interesting because I feel like these things are careful as we might try to be, like these things are going to happen. And so it's understanding like what could be the implications for that. It's going to be super interesting to watch that play out. So, how do you see your work today sort of shaping the future design for space stations and habitats? And how do you feel like we can integrate nature to make for a smoother transition for humans living in space?
Oh, I love that question. Okay. I'm so glad you asked me that. That got me excited for like a million different reasons. Two things immediately jumped to mind. Last year, I had the opportunity to present to some folks at NASA a concept around how do we take Earth with us? because for the 500,000 years or so that Homo sapiens have been roaming the planet, we've been in forests. There's all of these studies that show the psychological benefits that we as humans get from just being exposed to views of nature, even if it's artificial foliage or artificial plants. Just exposure to views of nature helps us psychologically, helps boost our immune system, our focus, all of these things we get from being immersed in nature. And we're used to it. When you have people who leave the planet and don't have things like gravity, don't have this sense of orientation, and don't have access to the things that our bodies have been used to being immersed in and that serve as a psychological healing agent for us, there's things that we're going to need to address that if we're really going to be serious about extending the stay of folks who are going to be pursuing life further and further out in the galaxy. And so the thinking there was taking some of my background working for Imagineering as an immersive experience designer, pulling from biomimicry. How can we create environments that essentially elicit the psychological benefits that we get by using a multisensory system to design a space module that was built off of, I can't think it off the top of my head, but we took that module as a framework and essentially built what we refer to as like the very first rough version of a holodeck, where the proposal is to create something where we can mount projectors into it and create a virtual environment where you're not wearing goggles, and then infuse multisensory, so sounds and even aromatic triggers that astronauts could go in here. You'd have some live and fake plants, and you just kind of float in this floating garden. As you know, the scientists who are growing some crops on it, they've reported how just seeing these living things grow has really been a huge benefit to their psyche as they're living on the space station. So exploring things like that, and actually have the chance to give another upcoming talk on the future of transportation for space and Earth. And the thing that I'm actually focusing on is how elephants, I think, serve as a great model for not only a future kind of multifunctional type of vehicle, elephants and slime mold, but also how if we start thinking about the idea of transportation not only as a system of circulation, but also as a method of migration, how we can really start to think about how we don't necessarily need to build stationary roads. We need adaptive pathways that, as the terrain of Mars with all of the storms and all that can kind of change things, we need to move away from building things that are durable to things that can adapt. Overall, I think that's where a lot of things are headed now.
Super interesting. I mean, I feel like that's something that, and this is an area that I'm pretty passionate about as well. Although I think I take it slightly different flavor, which is interesting that you're also kind of exploring this as well from like kind of a natural world perspective. Cause like my background's in urban planning. So one of the things that I feel like I've been really inspired by is the work of others where it's kind of designing for adaptability, designing for resilience, and less for permanence. So I feel like there has been historically, humans have been sort of hardwired to design things to be permanent, to settle, to impose upon your environment in really significant ways. And so I feel like that has been so much, what we have just that's our learned behavior, and so I think we have to really try to, like, unlearn that and sort of figure out, okay, in space, building for that kind of permanence, it's just not gonna work in the same way. We need to be able to reuse different infrastructure setups, like, we need to have things that are flexible, and even with our habitats, we need to be able to convert and change things as needed. I think that's a mindset we have to let go of. We're not trying to build monuments in space. That's just such a dated idea. So that's really fascinating that, like, from the natural side, you're also thinking about that. That's super cool. Okay, so are there animals that you think could help us figure out how to adjust to low or near zero gravity environments?
Okay, I have an answer to that. It doesn't solve for low G, but there was a study done, I want to say in like 40s or the 50s. I think it was the Air Force. They took up several animals on a parabolic flight. They took up like pigeons and cats and dogs, I want to say like rabbits
Oh, wait, you know
too.
what? I think I have seen a video of, like, a cat floating around.
Yes. Yes. So they took all these animals up on this parabolic flight so that they could experience zero G for like 10, 11 minutes or something like that. And they recorded these animals. And from that, what they realized was the way that cats are able to essentially like land on their feet whenever they're, falling, they use their tail to essentially, I want to say, create a sense of inertia that helps them contort and twist their body to orient themselves as they fall. And what they realized was cats in zero G, they would also use the same tail strategy to orient themselves in zero G. And so from them studying that, they actually created and wrote a manual for astronauts because they hadn't sent anyone beyond orbit yet. So they created a manual where they mimicked the way that cats contort themselves for astronauts who need to reorient themselves in zero G. That's the closest example that comes to mind right now of something like where like there's a direct correlation between an animal being biomimicked, for lack of a better phrase, into something for space for zero G.
This is something that actually I feel like we talked about a little bit on Clubhouse as well, but, like, do you see in our future, are there going to be animals in space with us? Do you see a future for this? Is it even ethical to bring animals with us to space?
I remember that conversation. I think my response to that was, "It's not ethical now." Like, even that, like, watching it, it was, like, really interesting, but at the same time, I'm like, "These poor
These poor
these
cats,
poor"
like, they're
Yeah, they're
terrified, yeah.
freaking out, they've never
Yeah.
experienced they have no point of reference for zero G. So, I think the ethics around some of this stuff right now is, at the very least, dubious, but I think at some point, we will have to build the ethical way to transport them because I do think we will need them. I do think at some point for creating the ecosystems that can sustain life, I don't think we can just constantly rely on shipments from Earth or from satellite stations or whatever, resupply missions. At some point, if we're going to get serious about it, I think terraforming is that's a whole other conversation. But for us to have sustained ecosystems, we're going to need the other parts of ecosystems that make the system of these ecologies work. I do think we'll need to transport some organisms right now. And we're really honestly just scratching the surface of not only studying how we live in space for a year, but also how some of these animals live in space. And we're just still 2022 scratching the surface around that. So it'll probably be a while. But for us to do it right, we will have to find ethical ways to make that transport work for them.
Well, and one of the other topics that's super interesting that you speak on is examining the connection between space exploration and the Black experience. Can you elaborate on some of those connections?
Part of why I started that was I get the great opportunity to speak to a lot of students in STEM. It's one of the things I love to do most, especially talking to Black students, making sure that they have the same confidence to explore space as a pathway, as a career, as a passion is important to me. And so, one of the things that I'm exploring in my spare time is I'm trying to trace the history of enslaved Africans following the North Star to freedom, in part because before the transatlantic slave trade, colonialism, there were cultures that existed. You could arguably say all the cultures that existed on the continent of Africa had some form of archaeoastronomy, right? Some kind of ancestral understanding of the stars. And for humans collectively, the first stargazers were farmers who would look up to the sky, get some kind of understanding of the patterns, create these kind of celestial connections. And then not only were the first stargazers farmers, they were also the first storytellers because they would have to tell stories, they would have to create stories about the stars to help them remember the seasons so they knew when to plant and grow crops. So this idea of astrobiofuturism in my mind, that connection between the stars and the land and the earth and our experience it's as old as that of an idea. But if you can imagine being someone who is captured, who is, a farmer, because the people that were brought over on those ships, they were skilled laborers. You're trying to build a nation, you need skilled laborers. You don't need somebody who just don't know nothing. To cultivate the land, they were looking for Africans who are farmers. So if you can imagine being someone who understands the land and you use the night sky and the stars as a way to help you orient and understand where you are in time and space, being put on a ship and then being taken off that ship and looking up, and literally the sky is completely different. There's a break in connection there. But the thing that I'm exploring and trying to connect the dots on is reminding particularly African American students that the connection to pursuing the stars, not only as a form of us finding liberation, but also as an ancestral part of who we are, is something that is inherent. So you have an ancestral background to give you confidence to explore that if that's something that you're interested in. And the other part of that was there's always been this interesting relationship, I think, between the African American experience and space. So you have Gil Scott Heron's Whitey on the Moon, which is, it lays it out like a rat done bit my sister Nell, but Whitey's on the moon. I can't pay her doctor bills, but Whitey's on the moon. So all of these things where he's talking about the dichotomy of what is seen, and we both know like NASA's budgets are minuscule and all of that, but the social commentary is there, right? The same day that SpaceX launched 4 civilians into orbit for the first time was the same time that we had protests around George Floyd's murder. The day that Dr. Martin Luther King got assassinated, the Apollo 6 mission was launched. So there's always this interesting, sometimes often tragic dichotomy at play between space and the African American experience. And then, one of the things that I came across that I found really interesting was that there's this chip in everyone's cell phone. I think it's called like a CMOS sensor. You see it in x-rays and all of that. And in thinking about how cell phones have become one of the greatest tools of accountability for social justice movements, particularly in the US, it's been one of the greatest assets that an African American has had in dialogues around police brutality and things of that nature. The ability to have a camera in your phone comes from that sensor, which was developed for space exploration. So there's all of these really interesting social connections between exploring space, which is a huge part of why the astro part of my astrobiofuturist work is part of that. Because how can we use some of the technology that has been developed or is in development to intentionally address some of the social and socioeconomic challenges of the human condition today? And I think that's at the core of it. That question of like, well, what does space have to do with the daily concerns? Like that's a big part, the central part, honestly, of my work as an astrobiofuturism. The last thing I want to say about that is partly why that I'm so passionate about that in particular is because there's been a burgeoning of companies around space right now. And they will say, we're doing this, we're building this, we're designing this, and it can be used for this on Earth. And it's really more of a marketing thing because it takes intentionality to go from it can be used to it is being used. And people will sell space on account of what it could be used for Earth. But we need more companies that are intentionally focused on intentionally using space tech, space exploration for Earth.
First off, like, just going back to your sort of, like, original response to that question too, I have to say that was, like, the most poetic way of kind of weaving the past, the present, and the future together in terms of those connections between space exploration and the Black experience. So that was you're just such an amazing storyteller, Billy, which you already know that. But the other thing too is that you're absolutely right. Like, we have to have companies that are more intentional and that are actively looking for those linkages. Like, I still think that there's just not enough multidisciplinary thinking in what we're doing. There's just not enough yet of people that are kind of stepping outside of the realm of what they're used to doing and saying, okay, how does that puzzle piece fit into some other puzzle piece that might feel really distant from where we are right now? Because that's really where innovation happens. Like, that's where the exciting moments of like, aha, like we figured something out or we're seeing something in a different way for the first time. Those are the important things that we should really be looking for. I mean, as you know, this is one of the things that I'm pretty worried about with the space industry is that we're sort of just kind of pursuing things in the status quo. Like we're sort of resting on our laurels here by thinking that just by repeating sort of what's worked maybe in the past, that that's the best way forward. And I just really like to challenge people on that. And I hope that that's something that like the media that we produce contributes to that in some small way, is that we're really trying to like challenge people to think more outside the box and to sort of challenge their preconceived notions. Because if we don't, I just think we're going to move at such a slower pace. We're going to be so limited in terms of like what we know and what we understand about the world and our place in it.
I 100%, 1000% agree with all of that. And I think, how do the priorities of NASA change if it's run by a collection of Native American astronauts or thinkers? How does what we're looking to do on the moon, how do those priorities shift when there's a different group of people with a different set of values and priorities? What are the things that we're missing because we're so focused on literally mining? We're focused on industry. We haven't even fixed industry on this planet, but we are ready to mine some of these other asteroids and other opportunities. What are the beautiful things that we're missing out on that space and being in space can teach us when we look through the lens of people who dream different and believe different? It's obviously a scary thought for some people because it hasn't been allowed to be thought out loud in a way that decisions could be made around it. But I think it's the missing piece about, like you said, we're talking about for all mankind. And as great as space exploration is, the idea and the priorities are still baked in the thoughts that Werner von Braun had, right? We're still wrapped around that coil.
We had someone on in season 2 talking specifically about that, like, about how these narratives around space are just so shaped, these white male voices, and it's interesting because the people that are at the helm of kind of the space industry today are very heavily influenced by those voices. So it's like a cycle, and it's like, look, I'm not saying that all of the ideas. I mean, Werner von Braun, like, very tragic figure. Obviously, there's a lot there to unpack, former ties to Nazism and things like that. For All Mankind even talked about this on the show. There's a lot of really dark things in his past that he did that problematic to say the least. I mean, certainly not in his lifetime. I don't think he was ever really truly held accountable for those atrocities. But stepping aside from that, if you just look at maybe the last 100 years of what we quote unquote call an innovator, right? Close your eyes. What does that look like to you based on what you've seen in history books? And I think that's the big thing there is like we're just so guided by kind of this narrative that has been chosen for us. And I think it really excites me to like think about just widening this up, this industry up, this idea of space exploration to so many different types of people, because what amazing things will we learn? Like, I don't know. I'm excited to find out, but we have to change the way that we go about it. And unfortunately, right now, it does still worry me. I mean, I've had conversations, sadly, with different people that are in the industry and say, well, that's great, that we are having conversations about social and cultural aspects of space or things like that, or like, making it more inclusive. But really, like, that's not disruptive. Technology is disruptive. And I'm like, no, no, you've got it backwards. It's like who we bring to the table, the ideas, the culture, the like different perspectives that we bring to it. That's what's disruptive. The technology will follow.
And we haven't talked about the expanse yet. I bring it up because I'll back up a little bit, right? Like Steve Jobs and the iPad, right? We all know like the connection between the iPad and the not the tricorder, but the computer pads that they had on Star Trek. There's these connections from these ideas that people see as kids, and then their ability to make these things real, and how that idea of how this thing should function becomes proliferated by people who are put in a position or and put themselves in a position to make these things in mass. So, like you're saying, these ideas that exist, the way that we're getting to space is based on those ideas. And the way that these settlements are being planned are still rooted in these ideas of how the world operates today. So we are, by extension, taking these very old ideas, very old ways of thinking, and we are supplanting them for the future of what the experience on Mars and on the moon will be. As we're building the ship, we're extending the ideas in a way that it's going to continue to be hard to change it. It goes back to the conversation we're just having about durability versus adaptation. Are we building in a system that will allow us to adapt the infrastructure of what will exist on Mars around what ideology could emerge from the perception of the overview effect of seeing Earth? No one has had that for Mars yet because no one has stepped foot on that. So, how are we accounting for the overview effect of human beings on Mars in the infrastructure of what is being built to last on Mars now?
Oh my gosh, Billy, this conversation, I feel like this should be like a 10-part podcast series because this is so interesting. I've got one more question and then I'll do our lightning round, but honestly, I could talk to you about this for days on end. So, celestial citizen, I ask this of everyone that comes on. We're all about the idea that humans can become not only better stewards of Earth, but also better interplanetary citizens. In your opinion, what is one important way in which people can work toward becoming celestial citizens today?
Honestly, I think we haven't talked about kids yet on this podcast. This was a big thing for me. The minute that I remembered that my 6-year-old daughter is a human being who's only been on Earth for 6 years, completely changed the way I went about trying to be her parent. And it changed my perspective from teaching her and trying to be the parent that I had, which I thought was great, to seeing her as an individual human who is experiencing life completely different than how I did. And it made me listen more to learn how I can help her grow into the adult human she will eventually be. And so for me, the lesson in that is reminding myself that people whose ideas, ideologies, and behavior I don't always agree with are still humans experiencing life. And that becomes a bridge for me to better understand how I can be a better human to them and potentially help them in ways that I probably wasn't willing to when I was just looking at them based on my own preconceived notions of who and why they were.
Wow, and then, I mean, as a parent myself, I feel like that's something I really am now gonna take to heart because I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it. What a great way to end out, the main segment of the show here. So, I'll jump to the lightning round now. You can give an explanation as to why you picked the answer you did or no explanation at all. Just leave us in mystery. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay. Would you rather live on the moon or Mars?
The moon,
On the moon, your favorite space hobby would be what?
dune buggy,
Oh,
rover,
nice.
rover, rover roving,
Yeah, yeah.
and the moon because it's closer to Earth in case like something happens, like the transport back, and you always have the view of Earth, right?
Yeah,
So like you get to see
true.
some greenery while on the
Yeah,
moon.
it's nice to
Yeah.
still feel connected. Yeah, for sure. Okay, animal from which humans could learn the most.
Ooh, ants. I want to say
Nice.
ants.
Interesting.
They work hard. They build. They recycle everything. They're a community. They follow simple rules and make amazing things, and they can dynamically change whatever it is that they're working on. I think ants are some of the dopest living organisms, and mycelium. Ants are mycelium. Those two.
There's gonna be a lot of people excited to hear you say that. That's for sure. There's a big mycelium space community
I
out
am
there.
so pro space mycelium.
Yeah,
Yes.
I think
Yeah.
we're gonna have to do an episode just on that alone. Okay, animal that provides a cautionary tale to humans.
I want to say humans. I
That's a
want to say
great answer.
humans.
Yeah, that's a solid one. Animal that would adjust well to space. Maybe also humans, I don't know.
We've already talked about tardigrades. It sounds like spiders are doing okay.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. I
Well,
want to
I
say
got the creepy crawlies about spiders, that's for sure.
don't quote me on this, but I think jellyfish did all right. It took spiders a little bit to like get oriented, and they started making their webs in a different way. But I think they did all right.
Okay, Star Wars or Star Trek?
See, I'm of the Star Wars is sci fantasy, not sci-fi crowd. Deep Space Nine was my Star Trek. Captain Benjamin Sisko and Lieutenant Worf, those are my guys.
Mhm.
So I gotta go Star Trek. And
Nice.
then Star Trek Discovery, I'm just eating it up. I love it. The production design is just out of this
So
world.
good. Okay, The Martian, Interstellar, or Contact?
Ooh. Oh man. I gotta go with Contact.
Contact is
because
good.
yeah, I mean, like,
Good.
The Martian, love the production design, love all of that. The Space Botanist, that's my jam.
Yeah,
But
I thought you were gonna go with The Martian,
yeah,
actually.
I
Surprising.
was tempted. And, Interstellar is great because the whole farm thing and then, all of that, the space station and all of that is just awesome. But I have to say Contact because I think, like, where she landed as they were talking about religion, it's something that I don't talk about enough, but I'm probably gonna talk about more as I talk about space. I think I subscribe to the Christian system of beliefs, and I think more people who subscribe to that and are in the sciences need to speak up to counteract some of the falsehoods that people who have that faith. So for me, the conversation at the end where she kind of arrived at this moment where she had this thing that she experienced, but no one else would necessarily believe her. The irony of all of that, I just think it was really poetic and beautiful. So I'd have to say Contact.
Yeah, it's a pretty amazing film. I'll agree with you on that for sure. Okay, let's see. Something most people don't know about you.
Don't like dancing.
Really? Wow.
I can dance. A brother's got rhythm. I'm not super confident
Yeah.
in I chose,
That's okay.
I chose, space and Star Trek over buying CDs, so I would say like I'm not it takes like 30 minutes for my wife to get me to like do a two-step in public.
Really? Oh,
So
wow.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, man.
I got rhythm for the record for
Yeah.
anybody listening. I got rhythm, but I don't have confidence in my moves. You'll never see me doing a TikTok dance. I can guarantee you that.
Sure, yeah, that's fine. I think there's probably too many TikTok dances already out there in the universe, so Oh gosh. Okay, you're sent on a long duration mission. What's more important, choosing your crew, choosing the food, or choosing the destination?
I would say crew because and this is honest. You have to be willing to be okay with the idea that you are consuming the filtered urine of people that you are on a mission with for, 6 to 8 months. You have to be okay with that idea. So if you don't like these people, it's not there's no alcohol, right? So you have to be a cool person. We have to have camaraderie because the thought of that alone is gonna make you wanna choke somebody.
Yeah, no one's ever answered it that way. Wow.
It's those crazy little it's the
Uh,
experience, right? That's the experience part of me coming through. Like, what
yeah,
is the actual experience of this?
you gotta hit
And
people
I
with the
think
reality? So,
that's it.
yeah.
That's it. Like being stuck in a tube with people knowing that. Like, do you have good habits?
Yeah,
Are you drinking enough water?
yeah.
Those kind of things,
Did you stow
you
away
know?
a ukulele on this flight? Like, no,
Exactly.
we can't have that.
Exactly.
Yeah. Nothing against the ukulele, but just like small instrument, first one that came to mind. Okay, last one. Finish this sentence. In 50 years, we'll all be what?
In 50 years, we will either all be breathing fresher air or asthmatic.
I hope it's the former and not the latter. All right. Well, yeah, I've taken up a lot of your time today. So yeah, I just really appreciate your time for coming on the podcast today. This is a fascinating subject area, and I'm really excited to see where it goes. I'm definitely going to be following your work with astrobiofuturism, very closely if I wasn't already, but definitely will be here in the future as well. And I encourage everyone to check out your website as well. We'll of course put details in the show notes. But yeah, thanks again, Billy. I really appreciate it.
Oh, the pleasure was mine. I'm so glad we got to do this.
3, 2, 1. We have liftoff.
Let me take you on a little trip. My supersonic ship's at your disposal if you feel so inclined. Alright. We'll go travel faster than light. That little Elon Musk will be left in the dust, so alright. Say alright!
And to our community of Celestial Citizens, thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Celestial Citizen Podcast. This episode would not be possible without the terrific work of this show's editor, Victor Figueroa. Thank you, Victor. Also, a very special thank you to Graham Clark, who created the amazing intro and outro music for this podcast.
Needs to be out of sight. Out of sight. Nobody's gonna travel second class. They'll be quiet.
If you're interested in learning more about Celestial Citizen, and I hope you are, then check out celestialcitizen.com. You can also follow along on Twitter at Celestial Citizen and Instagram at The Celestial Citizen. And be sure to sign up for the Celestial Citizen newsletter on Substack. You can find the link to all of this on our website.
Ain't no bad shit. Ain't no lie. Laugh so hard you'll cry.
If you're interested in supporting the mission of Celestial Citizen, you can always reach out to learn more about opportunities to sponsor this podcast. A major component of Celestial Citizen is feedback and public participation. We want to hear what you have to say, so let us know what you think about humanity's future in space and what it should look like. Please share your unique voice and perspective on social media, or if you prefer, all of the Celestial Citizen articles can also be found on Medium. So drop a comment and join the conversation. If you love today's podcast, please have your friends and family subscribe on whatever device or platform you listen to podcasts on, and leave a stellar review so others can get hooked as well. That's all for now, Celestial Citizens. I'll be back next week for another episode. In the meantime, don't be afraid to take up space.